We pray as we open your word here in Nehemiah 4, God. This passage really impressed me with just a lot of principles, God. I ask that you would help me to impart that here to my friends tonight, God, um, that these truths and these characteristics we see in Nehemiah, God, that they would speak to us, God, that you would speak to us um, deep down in our hearts, and God, so that not only our hearts and minds will be changed, God, but our actions, how we respond uh, to uh, to your word tonight, God, would be altered. So, Lord, we pray your blessing upon tonight, and we ask all this in your name. Amen. Okay, so last week we got started on the wall, and we talked about all of these places around the wall, right? Just pretty standard stuff. And so we went all the way around the wall, and we're talking about, okay, so we have these guys building this and these guys building this, and just kind of all this stuff around that that is really difficult for us in a lot of circumstances to uh, yes, Bob, uh, to kind of picture nowadays. But enough of an understanding to know that there's a significant amount of work being done. And so we know who's working on what parts of the wall, but now we're actually going to start to see what's happening in the greater scheme of everything that's happening. Thank you, Cass. Yes. So, yeah, this week there's a little more storytelling. And in that storytelling, there's a ton of stuff that is really cool. I really like Nehemiah chapter 4, and you guys know this story, a lot of it. But there is so much in this chapter. It's really sweet. All right. So with my Bible just closed on the passage. Okay, it's fine. Can I get someone to read? Thank you. Computer is not responding well. That passage, the first 3 verses of Nehemiah 4. Okay. Don't you dare. It is open for anyone.
All right, I'll take this one.
All right, go ahead.
Now when Sanballat heard that we were building the wall, he was angry and greatly enraged, and he jeered at the Jews. And he said in the presence of his brothers and of the army of Samaria, "What are these feeble Jews doing? Will they restore it for themselves? Will they sacrifice? Will they finish up in a day? Will they revive the stones out of the heaps of rubbish, and burned ones at that?" Tobiah the Ammonite was beside him, and he said, "Yes, what they are building, if a fox goes up on it, he will break down their stone wall."
All right. So we have the bad guys, the token bad guys, Sanballat, Tobiah, and he says he's talking to the army of Samaria. Probably less of an actual army, but more like the leaders, just the leaders of that region, guys who would command forces or at least have certain militias or small groups at their command. He's talking to these guys, being like, "Look, these guys are a threat to our existence. They're actually trying this stuff." And so they start off by mocking the work in Jerusalem. So Sanballat's like, what are these Jews doing? They think they're going to restore this wall for themselves? Is that what they're doing? Are we going to let them sacrifice? Because remember, Samaria at this point is the center of worship for the Samaritans. Also, there's another. I'll get into this in a second, but there's a little bit of an implied thought about what Sanballat says there. He says, "Will they finish it are they going to finish it in a day?" When you combine that with the thought of, are they going to sacrifice? The idea is that, are they going to pray and make sacrifices to God and have Him just magically whoosh it up in a day? So he's kind of. I'll get into it in a minute. and then he makes this statement about are they going to build up the wall out of the rubbish and the burned ones? Yeah. So there you go, Kess. So that's the thing that kind of really it serves as the impetus for a lot that happens in this chapter is that Sanballat in that idea in what he says, he's mocking God. He's like, yeah, what's their God gonna do? It's like they're gonna try and build their wall. They're gonna try to establish their sacrifices, and their God's gonna help them, get the wall up together. What? Really, really? Yeah, it's that's the implied thought here. And then Tobiah, because remember Tobiah, we talked about this. He was probably one of like basically the lieutenant of Sanballat. He says, "Yeah, look what they're whatever they're doing. Whatever they're doing. If a fox goes up on it, he's surely going to break down their wall. I mean, it's so pathetic. A fox could jump up on it, and he's going to be too heavy for that wall to support." Okay, not anything super complicated about this. We just have these guys that are looking at what the Jews are doing, and they're like, let's make fun of them. Let's see if we can discourage them. Because for one, remember when Nehemiah came back, he came back with official papers from the king saying, "Yeah, let's do this thing. Let's rebuild this wall." So they don't have the ability to just straight up go in with military or armed opposition. They're like, let's just see if we can discourage these guys and get this to stop. Let's see if we can put a stop to it. Just because if we can make them not want to do it, then that's basically the same result, and we don't have to lift a finger. Okay? Lazy, yes, but also clever. Why would you risk going in combat or risk fighting when you can simply talk, say stuff, and get the same result? Yeah, and there were a lot of reasons for them to not go to war or not go and try to fight. Yeah, and that brings up a question later, but we'll cross that bridge when we come to it. Any questions so far? All right, it was nice and easy, just a nice start. How about the next two verses? I've mentioned before, I think I've mentioned several times that Nehemiah is a big fan of just these spontaneous prayers where he just like drops everything. There's like, here's a prayer. I'm just gonna boom here. He doesn't even always introduce it. It's just in the middle of whatever's happening. He's like, prayer. This is one of those. So if someone could take these two verses. Go for it, Wise Rat.
Hear, O our God, for we are despised. Turn back their taunt on their own heads and give them up to be plundered in a land where they are captives. Do not cover their guilt, and let not their sin be blotted out from your sight, for they have provoked you to anger in the presence of the builders.
All right. Now there's a fair bit going on here. First reading is like, man, Nehemiah has no chill. Listen to this guy's prayer. He's like, make these guys turn their reproach back on them and force them to live in a land where they're captives. Jeez. But Nehemiah kind of explains the reasoning for that. He starts off and says, he's like, listen, Lord, for we're despised. So he asks, he's like, God, hear us, we are despised. And then Nehemiah makes a request for action, but the action isn't tied to the fact that his people are despised. That's not ultimately what prompts this prayer. What does that is that we can see in verse 5 that they're guilty, the enemies, Sanballat, Tobiah, and all their ilk. They're guilty and they have sinned. And so it's not their, their animosity towards the Jews that's really the problem here. That's not good. But the real problem was their sin and their direct opposition to God. It says they have provoked you to anger in the presence of the builders. Oh, Cass, I'm dead serious. Stop reading my notes. I didn't even talk to you this time in advance.
I
Oh
didn't
my
know you were going to reference this verse. I honestly didn't.
I wasn't going to reference the verse directly, but there's a lot of correlations here, a lot of ideas that relate back to the showdown of King Hezekiah with the Assyrian army. The idea, and I'll bring it up several times. I'm serious. I'm going to find the camera. I don't know this, but I will find it. But we're going to see some stuff here, and I'll try to make mark of it as we come to it. But yeah, this is definitely, I don't know if this is quite as distinct a hyperlink. Ungrith might understand that a little bit better. But I definitely felt the similarities when reading through this. I was like, this rings of Hezekiah. Yep. That's one thing, was that Sennacherib, when he was sending his envoys and his notes into the city, he was trying to dishearten the people, and he was mocking God. It's the exact same thing we're seeing here. And what does Nehemiah pray for? He prays that God will turn their taunts back on their own head. How did God deal with Sennacherib's army? He had the Assyrians kill each other. Mm-hmm. Any thoughts on this? Any questions that we have so far? Well, Psalm 139. I mean, you know what else Psalm 139 is pretty famous for, right? Everything else, and that's, yeah, just about. For those that don't know, I'll read Psalm 139, 19 through 22. Oh, that you would slay the wicked, O God. O men of blood, depart from me. They speak against you with malicious intent, and your enemies take your name in vain. Do I not hate those who hate you, O Lord? And do I not loathe those who rise up against you? I hate them with complete hatred. I count them my enemies. Yeah, I didn't know that was in Psalm 139, the same one that says, search me, O God, know my ways. Or you have searched me and known me. You know when I sit down, when I rise up. That psalm. Yeah, it also has this in it. And one of the commentaries that I read actually was pretty blunt and said, look, Nehemiah's prayer is probably not something that we would be praying today. But it harkens a lot to a lot of the stuff that's written, in the Psalms. Just another hyperlink you can draw there. Nehemiah praying stuff that, that David would have sung about. A lot of that is related to the idea of Israel at that time. God's chosen people were a nation, an actual entity as a united, you know, well, nation, country. Whereas the church is not. It's multinational. We are an organized body, but we're not a country, and we are not. The distinction is such that we are not trying to preserve a nation's holiness. We are trying to spread the holiness of God to the whole world. Nehemiah was perfectly right in praying this prayer. All right, I know that's crazy, but remember, what was the reason that Nehemiah prayed this prayer? What drove him to this? Nobody's answering that question. The major factor that drove Nehemiah to this prayer is found in verse 5. It was the glory of God. They impugned God. They mocked him. And Nehemiah's like, that ain't standing. They dared to make fun of my God. If Nehemiah had prayed this prayer on behalf of himself, it was like, oh, they insulted me, they hurt my feelings, they say that I'm weak and such, then yeah, we would have a very good reason to call Nehemiah out for this, but that wasn't his reasoning. He makes it very clear in verse 5. He says, God, I want you to be able to do this because they made fun of you. I want you to knock it to them because no one makes fun of God. But it is an excellent question. Possibly, guess. It's tough to make a hyperlink forward. Because when we talk primarily Old Testament, when we talk about a hyperlink, it's a connection that a Jew would make. And the hyperlink forward, like Wise Rat pointed out, it would be to the Sermon on the Mount, and Jews are generally not very fond of that. But for a Christian looking through the lens of history, yeah, certainly. There are definitely connections. But even Jesus, when he talks about it, he says, he says your enemy when he talks about heaping hot coals on their head or loving your enemies. He never states that the reason for that, or states what the reason for that would be. Actually, he says that, pray for those who persecute you. Yep, that's good. And Jesus even makes a claim that any who blasphemes against the Holy Spirit shall not be forgiven. So mockery and blasphemy against God is seen very seriously, even in the New Testament. This is a good discussion. I'm excited about this one. This is good. I didn't think we'd sit here this long. We're 5 verses in. Great. How many verses does this chapter have? 23. Awesome. The Sunday school shock is strong. You guys have any other questions? I'm content to sit here for a while if you've got other thoughts or things that you're just kind of uncertain of or want answers to. Because this is one of those things where there's a little bit of shock value in this verse. Cast typing away. Undoubtedly, just stealing my thunder from something I was going to use in 5 minutes. One more thing to note that one of my commentaries pointed out, and I thought it was a really good one. When news of this comes to Nehemiah, it doesn't even introduce what he did. There's just a prayer. Nehemiah doesn't form a committee. He doesn't go and ask his counselors. What he should do, his very first thing is not even to write the 3 words "and I prayed." He just bang into the prayer. It wasn't his last resort. It wasn't his final option, the last line of defense. It was his go-to. He said, "God, your name is being mocked. For your sake, we're asking that you act." Fun discussion. So we ready to move on a little bit, or you guys have anything else? Guess I done. Dun 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 dun. All right. This is the kind of stuff that I like to get involved in when we have good discussion like this. You guys, comparing the Bible to itself to find out what the Bible means. Oh, you guys, I'm so proud. All right, let's take verses 6 through 9. Not 69, 6 through 9. There we go. Hyphen is important. Anyone want to take that passage? I mean, I can, seeing as how we're kind of going the cycle. Oh, Eli, go for it, sir.
We get back to it.
There you go. Yep.
So we built the wall, and all the wall was joined together to half its height, for the people had a mind to work. But when Sanballat and Tobiah and the Arabs and the Ammonites and the Ashdodites heard that the repairing of the walls of Jerusalem was going forward, and that the breaches were beginning to be closed, they were very angry. And they all plotted together to come and fight against Jerusalem and to cause confusion in it. And we prayed to our God and set a guard as a protection against them day and night.
Okay, there was a lot here that I love. So Nehemiah, right after this prayer, he says, "So we built the wall." Just right back to it. Who the heck cares what anybody says? We kept building, and this next phrase is just gorgeous. The wall was joined together to half its height. It's halfway up. For the people had a mind to work. Oh, that is so good. Does that not just get your juices flowing? We talked about this last week, that what God looks for most in his people is a willingness. And we see it right here, Nehemiah 4:6. The people had a mind to work. Oh, they were willing, and God said, "I can work with that." Oh, that's good stuff. Whew. But of course, where good things happen, people who don't want you getting good things are going to get angry. So Sanballat and Tobiah. Now this is I'll say this because this is a little subtle nuance that Nehemiah drops in here that we miss. So we see a number of guys that are all plotting together. We see Sanballat and Tobiah, and we see the Arabs and the Ammonites and the Ashdodites. So that just seems like, another listing of the ites. But in all honesty, that's kind of giving us a little commentary on the situation in Jerusalem. Because remember, where is Sanballat and Tobiah? Where are they at? Where's their center of operations? Samaria, right. Now, the Arabs were in league with Sanballat and Tobiah, but they were, Arabs, and so they were further to the south, more than likely on the Arabian Peninsula. The people of Ammon were perennially to the east. The nation of Ammon had been always one of the eastern borders of the nation of Israel. And the Ashdodites don't sound like anybody that we know until we think, hang on, the city of Ashdod, yeah, that was a city of whom? Yeah, the Philistines. And anybody know where the Philistines lived? On the coast, which was to the west. So literally, Bible says we have people, enemies on the north, Sanballat and Tobiah, the Arabs on the south. The Ammonites on the east, and the Ashdodites on the west. Israel, the people in Jerusalem were surrounded by people that were plotting to destroy them. It's easy for us to miss that. But the Israelites would immediately recognize, oh, those are people on all sides. That's not good. So they all plotted together to come and fight against Jerusalem and to cause confusion in it. Okay. Well, let me come back to that. So we prayed to our God and set a guard as a protection against them day and night. This is where things start to get a little more interesting, and I think a little more, well, I don't want to say more, where there's a practical application that, I don't know, I don't want to say it makes us uncomfortable, but I think can be overlooked. So for starters, it says that Sanballat and Tobiah and all these guys, they plot to attack and to cause confusion in Jerusalem. I'm going to jump ahead a little bit, but do they ever attack? No, they don't. Did they manage to cause confusion and dishearten the people in Jerusalem? We're going to see that they actually kind of did. It just doesn't last. Again, remember, these guys, Nehemiah and the Jews, have written papers from the king saying this is a thing. But what they were relying on is not the actual attack, but the threat of an attack. If mocking didn't do it, then maybe escalation of the threat would be a significant enough deterrent to cause them to stop the work. We're going to find out how Nehemiah knew. Eli, the next bit of verses, it's gonna there's going to be a bit that indicates that Nehemiah had some informants. But yeah, also it is a propaganda war. We saw a couple chapters ago that Sanballat was actually communicating with Nehemiah and sending him notices, whether it was a messenger or a letter or whatever. Yeah, because they just definitely had a tavern in Samaria. No, all right. And so again, in response to a crisis, Nehemiah says, "And we prayed to our God." And then, not only did they pray, they followed that up. They did something. It says, "We set a guard as a protection against them day and night." Does this indicate a lack of faith on the part of Nehemiah and the Jews? Eli says no. Right. And this is something that I really want us to notice is that there is, well, I'll see if someone mentions it, but when I was reading Nehemiah 4 and preparing for tonight's study, there's another passage of scripture that comes to mind, like even stronger than the story of Hezekiah versus Sennacherib. And we'll see what it is, but there's a principle that Nehemiah demonstrates very powerfully. And so I just kind of want to leave that there and see if you guys can pick up on it as we go. That verse there is the first kind of indication of it. All right. Any questions so far? So we have the mocking, we have Nehemiah's response, they keep building, they've got the walls halfway up, and now Sanballat and Tobiah are escalating. They're now actually actively threatening to attack. Okay? So let us go ahead with the next 5 verses. If somebody wants to take these. Go ahead, Kes.
In Judah it was said, "The strength of those who bear the burdens is failing. There is too much rubble. By ourselves we will not be able to rebuild the wall." And our enemies said, "They will not know or see till we come among them and kill them and stop the work." At that time the Jews who lived near them came from all directions and said to us 10 times, "You must return to us." So, in the lowest parts of the space behind the wall, in open places, I stationed the people by their clans, with their swords, their spears, and their bows. And I looked and arose and said to the nobles and to the officials and to the rest of the people, "Do not be afraid of them. Remember the Lord who is great and awesome, and fight for your brothers, your sons, your daughters, your wives, and your homes."
All right. Thank you. So now we have another problem. Now, when it says in Judah, this is more than likely referring to the men of Judah, not just because we're in the land of Judah. This is referring to the people who were of the tribe of Judah, which is kind of a problem because Judah is supposed to be leading this whole thing. Judah's the tribe of the kings, the strong tribe. That was kind of Jacob's blessing upon Judah back in Genesis. As Judah's coming to him and was like, "Oh, we're tired. We don't feel strong. There's too much rubble. We'll never be able to rebuild the wall by ourselves." That's not good. What's worse is that they report that their enemies are saying that, listen, they're not going to know. They're not going to know what's going on. They're not know we're coming until we're upon them and we kill them and we stop the work. Yeah. Keeps coming back to that. Who is Nehemiah descended from? Yeah. Yeah. Now, referencing back to that thing that I talked about, how Nehemiah had informants, we see that in verse 12. That time the Jews who lived near them, and when it's them, they're talking about Sanballat and Tobiah, the enemies. They're Jews that lived near them and found out what was going on. And so they come back and it's, I love it. They said to us 10 times, you must return to us. These guys are like full scale panic. So I'll ask again, did Sanballat and Tobias manage to dishearten the Jews? You hear something for long enough, and eventually you'll start to believe it. So the wall's halfway up, but in order for that to be the case, we know there was a lot of work that went in. And so obviously, with all the stuff that you're doing, it's probably not going to come as any shock that there were probably a few tired people. You're basically having to remove all the old rubble, which we'll get to in a second, and then rebuild the wall where it's fallen down. Now, this old rubble is stuff that's no longer used. It's been burned. It's been broken down. The rubble is not fit for usage in rebuilding the wall. And so, in order to properly build up the wall, you have to remove this stuff that's no good for usage in it. Now, we know that they can't build in these areas because they're having to remove it. But if they remove it, what happens? What does that do? Yes! If there's rubble, there's obviously something that's blocking you building the wall. But if you remove the rubble, then the hole becomes much clearer. And what did we just? Yeah, exactly. Our enemies are plotting to attack, and now you want us to remove the rubble and just being like, hey, let's just build them. Instead of just, we've been building these gates. Let's make a gate called the enemy's gate. Let's just let them in here. Yeah, very much so. It's like they're complaining that, there's so much work. We got to remove the rubble. And even if we remove the rubble, then it makes it easier for our enemies to attack us. And there's not enough of us. We can't build anything. Yeah. Oh, man. So, what happens? So, in the lowest parts of the space behind the wall, meaning where the wall was the lowest, where they had to remove the rubble, I stationed the people by their clans, sticking with the family thing that we talked about last chapter, with their swords, their spears, and their bows. So they armed them. So back in verse 9, they said that they set a guard. Now that things are becoming even more serious, because now we're seeing actual disheartening among the Jews, Nehemiah says, all right, now we're not just going to post a guard. Now we're going to actively have people armed in the most vulnerable places. And he says, and I looked and I arose and said to the nobles and the officials and the rest of the people. So he starts with the leadership. Then he goes to the rest of the people. Says, don't be afraid. Why not? Well, Nehemiah is really good about explaining what he means, because in the very next phrase, he says, remember the Lord, who is great and awesome. and fight for your brothers, your sons, your daughters, your wives, and your homes. So Nehemiah makes this strange kind of statement. He says, don't be afraid. We've got this awesome and great God that can do anything, and he can protect us. And so we have no reason to fear. But at the same time, I want you to fight for all that you hold as dear. Does that feel self-contradictory to anybody a little bit? If God's so great and awesome, then why do we have to fight? I'll let you guys think on that one. I'm still trying to lead you hints to that other passage I'm thinking of. All right, so let's get the next 6 verses. If someone wants to take these, if no one wants to take these, since we've gone around a little bit, then I'll take these, but I'll leave it up to you guys first. All right, Eli, go ahead, sir.
When our enemies heard that it was known to us, and that God had frustrated their plan, we all returned to the wall, each to his work. From that day on, half of my servants worked on construction, and half held the spears, shields, bows, and coats of mail. And the leaders stood behind the whole house of Judah, who were building on the wall. Those who carried burdens were loaded in such a way that each labored on the work with one hand and held his weapon with the other. And each of the builders had his sword strapped to his side while he built. The man who sounded the trumpet was beside me, and I said to the nobles and to the officials and to the rest of the people, the work is great and widely spread, and we are separated on the wall, far from one another. In the place where you hear the sound of the trumpet, rally to us there. Our God will fight for us.
Okay, thank you. So now we get a little bit of confirmation from what I kind of hypothesized earlier, that the plot to attack was just an escalation of the mockery, a threat that was never intended to be acted upon, because now that they have a guard, an armed guard in the walls, they're like, well, darn, they're still building. And so the Bible says our enemies heard that it was known to us and that God had frustrated their plan. Their plan was just to get them to stop building, and it didn't work. But Nehemiah is like, I don't think they're done, and my mama didn't raise no fool in Persia. So he's like, they thwarted this time, but I'm not betting that they're just going to leave us alone now. Still a serious issue. The possibility of attack is a real one. And so he says, all right, here's what we're going to do. The Second Amendment. Oh, no, it's not. So Nehemiah says, I got half of my men to hold the spears, the shields, the bows, the coats of mail, all of the weaponry, all of our armaments, these guys would have, and the other half would go build on the wall. And it says that even the guys that are building, they're doing it in such a way that they have a trowel to build the wall in one hand, and they got a sword equipped at their side. So in the event of an attack, everybody's ready to go. And so contingencies were in place. Their primary purpose was to build the wall, but if they needed to fight, they would. And even in more so, Nehemiah, as the work continues, they're having people remove the rubbish away, and they're starting to build up the walls and the gaps. And as more and more places need work, Nehemiah starts to realize that they're spreading out more and more and more. And so if an attack does come, if there's less people in any one given area, it makes it easier for an enemy to get through. So he goes to the leaders of the city and is like, hey, that's not good. We're all widely spread out, and we're kind of far away from each other. So in order to try and to streamline or to make it more efficient in the event of an attack, he implements the system of trumpets. And so he's got guys stationed throughout the city, each with a trumpet. So, the shofar. And he says, if you hear that, everybody rally there, and we're going because there's an attack there. So we just don't want just a few people by themselves trying to hold off this place. If there's a determined attack, we're going to send our everybody's going to rally there and hold off our enemies. So once again, Nehemiah, seeing the potential for a problem, has a plan in place. And then, of course, he ends out verse 20 with another statement. He says, our God will fight for us. Once again, Nehemiah with a call for faith in God that he would protect them, even though he's calling them to act. All right? Any thoughts on that passage, or that little section? Nobody typing? All right. I will take these last three because I haven't done any tonight. So, we labored at the work, and half of them held the spears from the break of dawn until the stars came out. I also said to the people at that time, let every man and his servant pass the night within Jerusalem, that they may be a guard for us by night and may labor by day. So neither I, nor my brothers, nor my servants, nor the men of the guard who followed me, none of us took off our clothes. Each kept his weapon at his right hand. So we have this guard, this active militia, I guess, for lack of a better term, standing and keeping watch to protect Jerusalem in the event of an enemy attack. And Nehemiah says, look, if you're working on the wall, don't be outside the city. It's dangerous, and who knows what our enemies might try. Everybody get within Jerusalem. The walls are coming up. There's actually some protection in the city now. Everybody hang in here, because not only are the walls coming up, but this is within the bounds of our guard, and we can protect you better in here. See, Eli. Oh, he's done. All right. Then Nehemiah says, and neither I nor my brothers, nor like the guard, the servants, or anybody, nobody took off our clothes. So when they, in the evening when you would go to the sleep, those that were not part of the night guard, when they would go to sleep, they wouldn't get changed. Like we would get changed in our pajamas or something, or whatever you do. These guys wouldn't do that. They'd stay in their clothes. So in the event of an attack, they were ready at a moment's notice. You get up, you got everything on. You can just rush out there and go help. And each kept his weapon at his right hand. All right. And there we go. So threat is real, and Nehemiah constantly, throughout this passage, again and again and again, rallies the people and formulates a plan and calls upon the people to remember and trust in God, even though he's asking them to be willing to stand and fight. Even more so, Sanballat talks about it at the beginning. He says, are they just going to, make a sacrifice and then watch as God brings up their wall in a day? No, it's the people building the wall. So with that in mind, have you guys figured out what the other passage I'm thinking of is? Here's a hint. We've done a study on it before, on this book. Within the last, well, gosh, time dilates. It is not in Judges. It's not the one I'm thinking of, at least. Back further. No, but you guys keep picking the right letter. Towards the end of the New Testament, the first chapter of the book of James. The first couple chapters talk about a man who talks about his faith. And James eventually says, you can show me your faith without works, and I will show you my faith by my works. I see in this passage a lot of parallels to James. The idea of Nehemiah's constant calls to believe in God, to trust in God, to remember God, but at the same time, calling them to action. Could God have protected his people without the Jews lifting a finger? Sure, but he doesn't. One of the amazing things to me is the verse, is Nehemiah's first prayer in this chapter. He says, God, turn back their taunt on their own heads. He asked God to just absolutely put these guys to shame. Do we see that happen in this passage? Yeah, they were a little disappointed, but I wouldn't say that they had their taunts turned back on their heads. Any shame or reproach that they may have felt was not to the degree that Nehemiah prayed for. So did God just not listen to Nehemiah's prayer? Did he disregard it? Did he not think it was one? Oh. And see, this is something that I find remarkable about this passage. We've all heard the phrase, the idea that God works in mysterious ways, right? We're all familiar with that idea. We as people, just throughout the entirety of our existence, are so consumed and so linearly set on being comfortable and appeased. Even in our prayers, our thoughts, our requests, anything that we say, it's like 99% of the time is about comfort or getting our way or getting what we want. And even Nehemiah, whether he meant to or not, he's kind of praying. He kind of feels like he's almost asking for the same thing. He's like, God, I want these guys to have to just be made a mockery of in the way that they made a mockery of you. And God says, okay, I'm not opposed to that, but here's a secret. I'm spoilering, the next couple chapters. So if you're not, if you don't want the story spoiled, then go ahead and disregard. But in Nehemiah chapter 6, verse 16, they finished the wall, and it says that, and when all our enemies heard of it, all the nations around us were afraid and fell greatly in their own esteem, for they perceived that this work had been accomplished with the help of our God. So God answered the request of Nehemiah, but he did it in a way that Nehemiah didn't expect, that I would say, that the rest of the people in Jerusalem didn't expect. He said, I can do it, but what I need for you guys to act out in your faith in me, to trust me when you're discouraged, when it's hard, when it's scary. Because yes, we have the same goal. It's just that the path that I've chosen is a different one than what you first prayed for. God works in mysterious ways to the degree that he works in ways that aren't initially or aren't what we may have conceived. There we go. No, you weren't the only one. So that's the story of this week. Nehemiah, he continues to show tremendous leadership skills. His ability to, rally his people whenever he sees discouragement. He sees plans and forms, or he sees potential problems and forms plans around them. He's a man who has, pretty decent foresight and an understanding of the needs of his people. We see that he puts God first, and isn't afraid to go to God for. In fact, he goes to God first most of the time. He says that, in verse 4 and 5, we see him praying, and then in every other time that we see prayer, it's that he brings the people. He incites the people to prayer. It's not just him, it's him and all of the people praying. And we see that he's a man of action, not just a man of faith who prays. How easy would it have been for the people of Israel to say, We pray, God, that we really want this wall built, and then just never lift a hammer and just expect God to just like shake the earth and just whoop, walls. It's ridiculous. God could certainly have done it, but God chose to use his people. Truth. That's a good statement. I like that, Cass. Nonsense doesn't become sense just because you add God into it. Ah, of course. I was like, that sounds really good. That would be why, Lewis. Obligatory C.S. Lewis quote. If you're doing Bible study bingo, there's one. I think of a lot of things where this applies. I think the most obvious, or for me, one of the most obvious ones is in our workplaces. God can give us a burden for those in our workplaces, people that aren't saved, the lost. We can say, God, family members that are unsaved. God, I really want this person to come to Christ. That's a great prayer. That's absolutely fantastic. What are you doing on that front? God could save that person in the next moment, but God could be calling you to be the voice that leads that person to him. I remember that quote from when I read The Problem of Pain. I'm thinking of a number of songs like that. There's a song by a guy named Scott Crepane called Sometimes He Calms the Storm. I could sing it, but I better not because he's a tenor and I'm not. It says, sometimes he calms the storm with a whispered peace be still. He can settle any sea, but it doesn't mean he will. Sometimes he holds us close and lets the wind and waves grow wild. Sometimes he calms the storm, and other times he calms his child. I'm sure the Jews would have loved a quick and easy solution. Absolutely. And not have to go through all the uncomfortable silence, the wondering if they were ever going to be attacked. But God said, I'm not using that. I want you guys to trust me when I don't perform a miracle. And he had a man in place in Nehemiah to rally them time and time again when they needed it. Rally them to believe in God and rally them to act again. And I think that's awesome. And definitely something that we can use every day. What do you guys think? Trust me, Bob, it would be a huge lie said if I tried to say that I don't struggle with that, or if I say that if any Christian said that they don't struggle with that. We often talk about the life of faith, but James, in so many ways, even within the Christian community, is seen as kind of a weird book because it's so much about works. Yeah, have a good night, Ms. Wise Rat. Tell your husband I'm sorry that I didn't say goodbye. But yeah, I always keep you guys too long. I'm sorry. What other thoughts have you guys got, if anything? And Bob is apparently just writing on a novel over there. It appears, Bob, that the floor is yours. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and just put out a call for prayer requests. We'll start taking those, and if Bob has a question, then we'll address that. I'll go ahead and drop mine. My mom had her appointment